Hello and welcome to the Curtis Podcast Network. I'm your host, Curtis Brown, and this is the 27th installment of That Political Show. We will be finishing up the chapter in Basic Economics on investment, and we'll get into some political news as well as some stock talk. But first, a quick shout out now to Arcade Dreamer for the instrumental version of Dangerous from his debut album Born in the Midnight. Available anywhere music can be listened to. Spotify, Amazon, Apple, etc. Follow him on Facebook and Instagram at Arcade Dreamer Official, Twitter at Arcade_Dreamer, YouTube at Arcade Dreamer, as well as his Bandcamp, Arcade Dreamer. You can also follow the Curtis Podcast Network on Facebook at Curtis Podcast Network, Twitter at Curtis Network, and TikTok at Curtis Podcast Network. Now, like I said, we're going to be diving back in here to basic economics. It's good to be back, people. I've had a very busy April. I'm very glad that May is here. I'm trying to get back to doing these every Monday. I've been very lazy about it, and I've had some oral surgery and stuff, and my son's birthday. So things came up, but I'm back. So. That Political Show, episode 27, let's get it on. Without any further ado, let's continue on reading from Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. We are reading the chapter on investments, and I believe we're picking back up at the tail end of page 290. The net result was that far fewer jobs were created than in similar periods of increased business activity in the past, leading to the phrase, a jobless recovery. To describe what is happening, as businesses were not confident that this recovery would last. In short, for sellers, the selling of inventory was a way of coping with economic risks. Only after inventories had hit bottom did the hiring of more people to produce more goods increase on such a large scale as to make the phrase a jobless recovery no longer applicable. Present value. Although many goods and services are bought for immediate use, many other benefits come in a stream over time. Whether a season's ticket to baseball games or an annuity that will make monthly pension payments to you after you retire. That whole stream of benefits may be purchased at a given moment for what economists call its present value. That is, the price of a season's ticket or the price paid for an annuity. However, more is involved than simply determining the price to be paid. Important as that is, the implications of present value affect the economic decisions and their consequences. Even in the areas that are not normally thought of as economic, such as determining the amount of natural resources available for future generations. Prices and present values. Whether a home, business, or farm is maintained, repaired, or improved today determines how long it will last and how well it will operate in the future. However, the owner who has paid for repairs and maintenance does not have to wait to see the future effects on the property's value. These future benefits are immediately reflected in the property's present value. The present value of an asset is in fact nothing more than its anticipated future benefits, adding up and discounted for the fact that they are delayed. Your home, business, or farm may be functioning no better than your neighbor's today. But if the prospective toll of wear and tear on your property over time is reduced by installing heavier pipes, stronger woods, or other more durable building materials, then your property's market value will immediately be worth your property's market value will be immediately worth more than that of your neighbor, even if there's no visible difference in the way that they are functioning today. Conversely, if the city announces that it is going to begin building a sewage treatment plant next year on a piece of land next to your home, the value of your home will decline immediately. Before the adjoining land has been touched, the present value of an asset reflects its future benefits or detriments, so that anything which is expected to enhance or reduce those benefits or detriments will immediately affect the price at which the asset can be sold today. Present value links the future to the present in many ways. And it makes sense for a 90-year-old man to begin planting fruit trees that will take 20 years before they reach maturity, because his land will immediately be worth more as a result of those trees. He can sell the land a month later and go live in the Bahamas if he wishes, because he will be receiving additional value from the fruit that is expected to grow on those trees, years after he is no longer alive. Part of the value of his wealth today consists of the value of food that has not yet been grown, and which will be eaten by children who have not yet been born. One of the big differences between economics and politics is that politicians are not forced to pay attention to future consequences that lie beyond the next election. An elected official whose policies keep the public happy up through election day stands a good chance of being voted in office another term, even if these policies will have ruinous consequences in later years. There is no present value to make political decision makers today take future consequences into account, when those consequences will come after election day. Although the general public may not have sufficient knowledge or training to realize the long-run implications of today's policies, financial specialists who deal in government bonds do. Thus, the standard... Sorry, an ant just crawled on my microphone. It's all right, I killed it. Although the general public may not have sufficient knowledge or training to realize the long-run implications of today's policies, financial specialists who deal in government bonds do. Thus, the Standard and Poor Bond Rating Service downgraded California state bonds in the midst of the state's electricity crisis in 2001, even though there had been no defaults on those bonds, nor any lesser payments made to those who had bought California bonds. And there were billions of dollars of surplus in the state's treasury. What Standard and Poor's understood was that the heavy financial responsibilities taken on by the California government to meet the electricity crisis meant that heavy taxes or heavy debt were waiting over the horizon. That increased the risk of future defaults or delay in payments to bondholders, thereby reducing the present value of those bonds. Any series of future payments can be reduced to a present value that can be paid immediately in a lump sum. Winners of lotteries who are paid in installments over a period of years can sell those payments to a financial institution that will give them a fixed sum immediately. So can accident victims who have been awarded installment payments from insurance companies. Because the present value of a series of payments due over a period of decades may be considerably less than the sum total of all those payments. Due to discounting for delays, the lump sums paid may be less than half of those totals, causing some people who sold in order to relieve immediate financial problems to later resent the deal they made. Others, however, are pleased and return to make similar deals in the future. Conversely, some individuals may wish to convert a fixed sum of money into a stream of future payments. Elderly people who are retiring with what seems like an adequate amount to live on must be concerned with whether they will live longer than expected, quote-unquote outliving their money, as the expression goes, and end up in poverty. In order to avoid this, they must use a portion of their money to purchase an annuity from an insurance company. For example, in the early 21st century, a 70-year-old man could purchase an annuity for the price of $100,000 and thereafter receive $772 a month for life, whether that life was 3 more years or 30 more years. In other words, the risk would be transferred to the insurance company for a price. As in other cases, the risk is not only shifted but reduced, since the insurance company can more accurately predict the average lifespan of millions of people to whom it has sold annuities that any given individual can predict his own lifespan. Incidentally, a woman aged 70 would get somewhat smaller monthly payments at $725 for the same price, given that women usually live longer than men. The key point is that the reduced risk comes from the greater predictability of large numbers. A news story some years ago told of a speculator who made a deal with an elderly woman who needed money. In exchange for making him the heir to her house, he agreed to pay her a fixed sum every month as long as she lived. However, this one-to-one deal did not work out as planned because she lived far longer than anyone expected, and the speculator died before she did. An insurance company not only has the advantage of large numbers, it has the further advantage that its existence is not only limited to human lifespan. Natural resources. Present value profoundly affects the discovery and use of natural resources. There may be enough oil underground to last for centuries or millennia, but its present value determines how much oil will repay what it costs to anyone who discovers it at any given time. And that may be no more than enough oil to last for a dozen or so years. A failure to understand this basic economic reality has for generations led to numerous and widely publicized false predictions that we were running out of petroleum, coal, and some other natural resources. In 1960, for example, a best-selling book said that the United States had only a 13-year supply of domestic petroleum at the existing rate of usage. At the time, the known petroleum reserves of the United States were not quite 32 billion barrels. At the end of the 13 years, the known petroleum reserves in the United States were more than 36 billion barrels. Yet the original statistics and arithmetic based on them were both accurate. Why then did the United States not run out of oil by 1973? Was it just dumb luck that more oil was discovered? Or were there more fundamental economic reasons? Just as shortages and surpluses are not simply a matter of how much physical stuff there is, either absolutely or relative to the population, so known reserves of natural resources are not simply a matter of how much stuff there is in the ground. For natural resources as well, prices are crucial. So are present values. How much of any given natural resource is known to exist depends on how much it costs to know. Oil exploration, for example, is very costly. In 2011, the New York Times reported 2 miles below the ocean floor, a ridge the size of a metropolitan Houston, modern-day wildcatters have pinpointed what they believe is a major oil field. Now they will have to spend $100 million to find out if they're right. That's a lot of money. That's some cheddar right there. The cost of producing oil includes not only the cost of geological exploration, but the cost of drilling expensive dry holes before striking oil. As these costs mount while more and more oil is being discovered around the world, the growing abundance of known supplies of oil reduces its price through simply supply and demand. Eventually, the point is reached where the cost per barrel of finding more oil in a given place and processing it exceeds the present value per barrel of the oil that you are likely to find there. At that point, it no longer pays to keep exploring. Depending on a number of circumstances, the total amount of oil discovered at any point may well be no more than 13 years' supply, which led to dire predictions that we're running out. But as the existing supplies of oil are being used up, rising prices lead to more huge investments in oil exploration. As one example of these kinds of costs that can be involved, a major oil exploration venture in the Gulf of Mexico spent $80 million on the initial exploration and leases, and another $120 million for exploratory drilling, just to see if it looked like there was enough oil to justify continuing further. Then there were $530 million spent for building drilling platforms, pipelines, and other infrastructure, and finally $370 million for drilling for oil where there were proven reserves. This adds up to a total of $1.1 billion spent. Imagine if the interest rate had been twice as high on this much money borrowed from banks and or investors, making the total cost of exploration even higher. Or imagine that the oil companies had this much money of their own and could put it in a bank to earn twice the usual interest in safety. Would they have sunk as much money as they did into the more risky investment of looking for oil? Would you? Probably not. A higher interest rate would probably have meant less oil exploration and therefore amounts of known reserves of petroleum. But that would not mean that were any closer to running out of oil than the interest rate were than if the interest rate were lower and the known reserves were correspondingly higher. As more and more of the known reserves of oil get used up, the present value of each barrel of the remaining oil begins to rise, and once more, exploration for additional oil becomes profitable. But as any given time, it never pays to discover all that oil that exists in the ground or under the sea. In fact, it does not pay to discover more than a minute fraction of that oil. What does pay is for people to write historical predictions that we are running out of natural resources. It pays not only in book sales and television ratings, but it's also in political power and personal notoriety. In the early 21st century, a book titled Twilight in the Desert concluded that sooner or later, the worldwide use of oil must peak. And that is because oil, like the other two fossil fuels, coal and natural gas, is non-renewable. And that is certainly true in the abstract, just as it's true that in the abstract that sooner or later the sun must grow cold. But that is very different from saying that this has any relevance to any problem confronting us in the next century or the next millennium. The insinuation, however, was that we faced some enduring energy crisis in our own time, and that the fact the price of crude oil had shot up to $147 a barrel, with the price of gasoline shooting up to $4, lent credence to that insinuation. But in 2010, the New York Times reported, just as it seemed that the world was running on fumes, giant oil fields were discovered off the coasts of Brazil and Africa, and Canadian oil sands projects expanded so fast, they now provide North America with more oil than Saudi Arabia. In addition, the United States has increased domestic oil production for the first time in a generation. Even though these huge uses of energy resources during the entire 20th century did not reduce the known reserves of natural resources used to generate that energy. Given the enormous drain on energy resources created historically by such things as the spread of the railroad networks, factory machinery, and the electrification of cities, it has been estimated that more energy was consumed in the first 2 decades of the 20th century than in all of the previously recorded history of the human race. Moreover, energy usage continued to escalate throughout the century, and yet known petroleum reserves rose. At the end of the 20th century, the known reserves of petroleum were more than 10 times as large as they were in the middle of the 20th century. Improvements in technology made oil discovery and its extraction more efficient. In the 1970s, only about 1/6 of all wells drilled in search of oil turned out to actually produce oil. But in the early 21st century, 2/3 of these exploratory wells produced oil. The economic considerations which apply to petroleum apply to other natural resources as well. No matter how much iron ore there is in the ground, it will never pay to discover more of it than the present value per ton. More of it when its present value per ton is less than the cost per ton of exploration and processing. Yet, despite the fact that the 20th century saw vast expansions in the use of iron and steel, the proven reserves of iron ore increased several-fold. So did the known reserves of copper, aluminum, and lead, among other natural resources. As of 1945, the known reserves of copper were 100 million metric tons. After a quarter of a century of unprecedented increases in the uses of copper, the known reserves of copper were 3 times what they were at the outset and by 1990, copper reserves had doubled again. The known reserves of natural gas in the United States rose by about one-third, from 1.5 trillion cubic feet to 2.07 trillion cubic feet just from 2006 to 2008. Even after a pool of petroleum has been discovered underground or under the sea, the oil is being extracted and processed. Sorry, got a text from parents checking on the boy. Economic considerations prevent that oil from being drained dry. The Economist magazine put it, a few decades ago, the average oil recovery from reserves was 20%. Thanks to remarkable advances in technology, this has risen to about 35% today. In other words, nearly two-thirds of the oil in an underground pool is left in the pool because it would be too costly to drain out all of it, or even most of it. With today's technology and today's oil prices, the oil is still there and its location is already known. If and when we are genuinely running out of oil that is available at today's costs of extraction and processing, then the next step would be to begin extracting and processing oil that costs a little more, and later on oil that costs a little more than that. But we are clearly not at that point when most of the oil that has been discovered is still left underground or under the sea. As technology improves, a higher rate of production of oil from existing wells becomes economically feasible. In 2007, the New York Times reported a number of examples such as this. The Kern River oil field, discovered in 1899, was revived when Chevron engineers here started injecting high-pressured steam to pump out more oil. The field, whose production had slumped to 10,000 barrels a day in the 1960s, now has a daily output of 8,500 barrels. Such considerations are not unique to petroleum. When coal was readily available above ground, it did not pay to dig into the ground and build coal mines, since the coal extracted at higher cost underground could not compete in the price with coal that could be gathered at lower costs on the surface. Only after the coal available at the lowest cost was exhausted did it begin to pay digging into the ground for more. The difference between economic approach and the hysterical approach to natural resource usage was demonstrated by a bet between economist Julian Simon and environmentalist Paul Ehrlich. Professor Simon offered to bet anyone that any set of 5 natural resources they chose would not have risen in real cost over any time period they chose. A group led by Professor Ehrlich took that bet and chose 5 natural resources. They also chose 10 years as the time period for measuring how the real cost of these natural resources had changed. At the end of the decade, not only had the real cost of that set of 5 resources declined, so had the cost of every single resource which they had expected to rise in cost. Obviously, if we had been anywhere close to running out of those resources, their costs would have risen because the present value of these potentially more scarce resources would have risen. In some ultimate sense, the total quantity of resources must of course be declining. However, a resource that would run out centuries after it becomes obsolete, or 1,000 years after the sun grows cold, is not a serious practical problem. If it is going to run out within some time period that is a matter of practical relevance, then the rising present value of the resource whose exhaustion looms ahead will automatically force conversation without either public hysteria or political exaggeration. Just as prices cause us to share resources and their products with each other at a given time, present value causes us to share those resources over time with future generations. Without even being aware that we are sharing, it is of course also possible to share politically by having the government assume control of natural resources as it can assume control of other assets in fact, of the whole economy. And direct allocation of resources by political institutions require far more explicit knowledge by a relatively small number of planners than is required for a market economy to be coordinated by prices to which millions of people respond accordingly to their own first-hand knowledge of their own individual circumstances and preferences, and the relative handful of prices to each individual has to deal with. Planners can easily make false projections, either from ignorance or from various political motives, such as seeking more power, re-election, or other goals. For example, during the 1970s, government scientists were asked to estimate the size of the American reserves of natural gas and how long it would last at the current rate of usage. Their estimate was that the United States had enough natural gas to last for more than 1,000 years. While some might consider this good news, politically it was bad at the time, when the President of the United States was trying to arouse public support for more government programs to deal with the energy crisis. This estimate was repudiated by the Carter administration, and a new study begun, which reached more politically acceptable results. Sometimes the reserves of a natural resource seem especially small because the amount available at a currently feasible costs is in fact nearing exhaustion within a few years. There may be vast amounts available at slightly higher costs of extraction and processing, but these additional amounts will of course not be touched until the amount available at lower costs is exhausted. For example, back when there were large coal deposits available on the top of the ground, someone could sound an alarm that they were running out of coal that was economically feasible to use, coal that could be gotten without prohibitive costs. But again, the whole purpose of prices is to be prohibitive. In this case, that prohibition prevented more costly resources from being resorted to, needlessly, so long as they were less costly sources of the same resources would be available. A similar situation exists today when most of the petroleum found in an oil pool is left there because of the cost of extracting more than most easily accessible oil cannot be repaid by the current market price. During the oil crisis of 2005, when the price of gasoline in the United States shot up to double what it had been in the 2 years earlier, and people worried that the world was running out of petroleum, the Wall Street Journal reported the Athabasca region of Alberta, Canada, for instance, theoretically could produce about 1.7 trillion to 2.5 trillion barrels of oil from its 54,000 square miles of oil sands deposits, making it second to Saudi Arabia in oil reserves. The Athabasca reserve remain largely untapped because getting the oil out of the sand is expensive and complicated. It takes about 2 tons of sand to extract 1 barrel of oil. If the oil prices remain near current levels, indeed, if prices stay above $30 a barrel, as they have since the late 2003, oil sands production will be profitable. Limited investment in production has been underway in Athabasca. If technology never improved, then all resources would become more costly over time, as the most easily obtained and most easily processed deposits were used up first, and the least accessible or less rich or more difficult to process deposits were then resorted to. However, with improving technology, it can actually cost less to acquire future resources when their time comes, as happened with the resources that Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich bet on. For example, the average cost of finding a barrel of oil fell from $15 in 1977 to $5 by 1998. It is hardly surprising that there were larger known oil reserves after the cost of knowing fell. Petroleum is by no means unique in having its supply affected by prices. The same is true of the production of nickel as well, for example. When the price of nickel rose in the early 21st century, the Wall Street Journal reported, "A few years ago, it would have been hard to find a better example of a failed mining project than Murrin, a huge, star-crossed nickel operation deep in the Western Australian desert. Now, Murrin is an investor favorite. Shares of the company that runs it have more than tripled in the past year, and some analysts see more room for growth." The surprising turnaround highlights a central fact of the current commodity boom, With prices this high, especially for nickel, even even technically difficult or chronically troubled projects look good. Nickel is widely used to make stainless steel. Although the reserves of natural resources in a nation are often discussed in terms of physical quantities, economic concepts of costs, prices, and present values must be considered if practical conclusions are to be reached. In addition to needless alarms about natural resources running out, there have also been, conversely, unjustifiably optimistic statements that some poor country has so many $billion worth of natural wealth in the form of iron ore or bauxite deposits from some other natural resource. Such statements mean very little without considering how much it would cost to extract and process those resources. And this varies greatly from place to place. Extraction of petroleum from Canada's oil sands, for example, costs so much that until recent years, the oil was not even counted in the world's petroleum reserves. But when the price of oil shot up past $100 a barrel, Canada became one of the world's leaders in petroleum reserves. That's going to do it for investments. We're moving on to Chapter 14 in Basic Economics, Stocks, Bonds, and Insurance. And we'll get into that next time. All right, so as we've read today, we figured out the real prices, really what influences them, and what influences the availability of natural resources and our perception of their availability. But I'm not really going to get into a whole lot of discussion there. We just read pretty much some of the most, intellectual deep dive that you could get into that. So it's not like I can really top it. But with that being said, let's try to dive in now to some political news. I know Joe Biden is basically just the worst, so let's see what he's got going on. First thing on here is about Donald Trump. Decision on Donald Trump's Facebook ban is coming on Wednesday. Biden raises refugee cap to 62,500 after earlier criticism. This is by NPR, so we'll see how this reads. President Biden announced that on Monday the administration is raising the cap on refugee admissions to 62.5 for the fiscal year, far above the $15,000 limit set by the previous administration, but below an earlier campaign promise. It is important to take this action to remove any lingering doubt in the minds of refugees around the world who have suffered so much and who are anxiously waiting for their new lives to begin, the president said in a statement. Biden said the earlier cap did not reflect America's values as a nation, and the United States had a commitment to protect the most vulnerable. But in April, the Biden administration fumbled an announcement around the cap, initially saying it would keep former President Donald Trump's low ceiling, but then later, after criticism from fellow Democrats, saying it would follow through with Biden's campaign promise to allow more refugees into the country this fiscal year. Even with the cap of 15,000 in place so far, only about 2,000 refugees had been let in by the end of March during the first half of the fiscal year 2021. Biden acknowledged in his Monday statement that the level of 62,500 will not be met in reality, blaming the work of his predecessor for setting the Biden administration so behind in meeting its goal. The sad truth is that we will not achieve 62,500 admissions this fiscal year. We are working to quickly undo the damage of the last 4 years, and it will take some time. But that work is already underway, Biden said. Biden later vowed to aim for his campaign goal of 125,000 refugee admissions next fiscal year, which begins in October. That goal will still be too hard to hit. We might not even make it the first year, but we are going to use every tool available to help these fully vetted refugees fleeing horrific conditions in their home countries. Under current allocations, the United States will be able to accept the most refugees, 22,000, from Africa. Thousands more are expected from East and South Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Europe and Central Asia, and many more. Oxfam, the humanitarian organization, praised the Biden administration for raising the cap, but criticized Biden and Trump for time lost in assisting in global refugee crises. Crises? I don't know. We are relieved that the Biden administration has, after a long and unnecessary delay, kept its promise to raise the refugee administration admissions cap for this year to 62,500. Oxfam, America's global policy lead Noah Gottschalk, said in a statement, "This announcement means the United States can finally begin to rebuild the life-saving refugee resettlement program and welcome tens of thousands of people who have been left stranded by 4 years of the Trump administration's xenophobic policies and 3 months of the Biden's inaction." Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say it because I really don't think it's got anything to do with policy here. People don't want to be here right now because Biden's in office. Nobody wants to, like, what are they running to? They're running to a lot of the same that they're fleeing from. And now, a lot of us are too blinded by our first world privilege to understand much of the struggle that goes on around the world. I have several friends who have parents who fled communist countries to come here and start a better life for their family. Those people are very well-adjusted, well-meaning people, and they're welcome in America. Okay? Nobody at any point should be putting a limit on our immigration. It is no coincidence that we had an open borders policy up until 1913, and the years post the Civil War, where, like, after the Civil War was over, the Reconstruction era began, there was a flood of immigrants coming in, and our economic climate exploded. There was so much labor, there was so many factory jobs, there was all this stuff going on. But what people don't understand is as things expand and as things change and as demands change, the need for these factories disappears in some way, shape, or form. So over time, if we have just let business be business and government be government, we would be seeing a very different America today. But instead, since 1913, we've had an extremely lackadaisical approach. When I say lackadaisical, I mean like they're trying to limit people from getting across the border, but now they're just incentivizing people to do it illegally. So it just seems that they can't win for losing. Let's see, political news. This isn't necessarily political news, but Titans' 4th-round draft pick out of Pitt has been charged with assaulting a woman. And apparently, he told this to police, "I have no problem with hitting a woman if she deserves it." End quote. And I heard that on the radio through some talking heads. And they have some pretty reputable sources behind it. I don't remember the sources particularly, but that's the thing. 2 in 5 American adults fully vaccinated as daily coverage of new COVID cases falls below 50,000. Jesus Christ, it's all football and stuff about movies. Where's all the news at? Here's one. This title jumped out at me, and I apologize for the dead air there, but let's see. My employer paid me in crypto. It rose 700% in value, and now he wants employees to return the crypto and accept dollars. I did some business development for a tech company on a contract basis. The CEO stated that I would be paid in crypto when I started to work in the spring of 2020. He added a clause to the contract stating the company may elect to pay in US dollars. I struck out that part of the contract because if I was going to risk getting paid in crypto and the price all of a sudden appreciated, I didn't want the company to revert to paying me in US dollars. In August 2020, I received payment for the contract worked in cryptocurrency. Since then, the prices of cryptocurrency have skyrocketed, and as of this moment, the crypto I have received in payment has gone up 700%. Today, I received an email from the CEO stating something along the lines of, since you did not generate any revenue for the company and are not currently doing any follow-up work, please send back all of the crypto received in August of 2020. You can invoice the company for the hours worked in US dollars, so basically stating that I can invoice the US dollars at 7 times less than what the crypto is worth today. Please note that there have been several other people trying to sell to the company's solutions. It is a startup, and so far they are trying to generate their first dollar in sales. The purpose of the contract was to generate sales, and it included a commission component. But the understanding was that I would bill hourly for cold calling and emailing people, generating proposals, setting up meetings, participating in leading pitches, etc., with the goal of generating revenue. I am not really sure what to do. I have worked with this person for many years, and he has a tendency to try to change the terms of payment after agreeing on a certain way of operating. What do you think is the fair solution? Should I return some cryptocurrency for hours worked? What should I tell this employer? Crypto confused. This was on MarketWatch.com, posted by someone called The Moneyest. So, that was pretty interesting. Everything's football right now. Okay, New York Times. Here we go. I like this one. Waiting on it to load. Frickin' internet. Am I right? Loading. Let's load. A psychedelic drug passes a big test for PTSD treatment. A new study shows that MDMA, known as ecstasy or Molly, can bring relief when paired with talk therapy to those with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. In an important step toward medical approval, MDMA, the illegal drug popularly known as ecstasy or Molly, was shown to bring relief to those suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder when pairing that with talking therapy. Of the 90 people who took part in the new study, which is expected to be published later this month in Nature Medicine, those who received MDMA during therapy experienced a significantly greater reduction in the severity of their symptoms compared with those who received therapy and an inactive placebo. 2 months after the treatment, 67% of the participants in the MDMA group no longer qualified for the diagnosis of PTSD, compared with 32% in the placebo group. MDMA produced no serious adverse side effects. Some participants temporarily experienced mild symptoms like nausea and loss of appetite. And this is about as excited as I can get going through a clinical trial, said Gul Dolan, a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, who was not involved in the research. There's nothing like this in clinical research trials for neuropsychiatric disease. Before MDMA-assisted therapy can be approved for therapeutic use, the FDA needs a second positive Phase 3 trial, which is currently underway with 100 participants. Approval could come as early as 2023. Mental health experts say this research, the first Phase 3 trial conducted on psychedelic-assisted therapy, could pave the way for further studies on MDMA's potential help to address other difficult-to-treat mental health conditions, including substance abuse, obsessive-compulsive disorders, phobias, eating disorders, depression, end-of-life anxiety, and social anxiety in autistic adults. And mental health researchers say these studies could also encourage additional research into other banned psychedelics such as psilocybin, LSD, and mescaline. This is a wonderful, fruitful time for discovery because people are suddenly willing to consider these substances as therapeutics again, which hasn't happened since in 50 years, said Jennifer Mitchell, a neuroscientist at the University of California, San Francisco, and lead author of a new study. But some mental health experts urged restraint. Alan James Francis, a professor emeritus and the former chair of psychiatry at Duke University, who was not involved in the new study, warned the new treatments are never as wonderful as they first seem. All new treatments in medicine have always had a temporary halo effect by virtue of being new and by promising more than they can possibly deliver, Dr. Francis said. Unlike traditional pharmaceuticals, MDMA does not act as a band-aid that tries to blunt symptoms of PTSD. Instead, people with PTSD, MDMA, combined with therapy, seems to allow the brain to process painful memories and heal itself, Dr. Mitchell said. Critically, MDMA taken in isolation without therapy does not automatically produce a beneficial effect. It's not the drug, it's the therapy enhanced by the drug, said Rick Doblin, senior author of the study and director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, a nonprofit research group that sponsored and financed the clinical trials. For this process to work, a person must be primed to engage with their trauma. Participants first undertook preparatory sessions with 2 trained therapists. Then in 3 sessions of 8 hours each, Jesus Christ, spaced a month apart, they received either an inactive placebo or MDMA. Neither the participants nor the therapist knew which. While most participants correctly guessed whether they had received a placebo or MDMA, this did not undermine the study's results or methodology, which was agreed to in advance by the FDA. Scott Ostrom, who participated in the study, had suffered from PTSD since returning home from his second deployment in Iraq in 2007. For more than a decade, he experienced debilitating nightmares. Bullets would dribble out of the end of my gun, or I would get separated from my team and I'd be lost in a town where insurgents were watching me, he said. Mr. Ostrom's days were punctuated by panic attacks, and he dropped out of college. He pushed his friends and family away and got into an unhealthy romantic relationship. He was charged with assault and attempted suicide. Therapy and medication did not help him. But after participating in the trial, he no longer has nightmares. Literally, I'm a different person, he says. During his first 3 sessions in early 2019, laying on the couch with eye shades in a lucid dreamlike state, Mr. Ostrom encountered a spinning, oily black ball. Like an onion, the ball had many layers, each one a memory. At the center, Mr. Ostrom relived the moment in Iraq. He said that I became the person I needed to be to survive that combat deployment. Over the next 2 sessions, Mr. Ostrom engaged with the bully, as he calls his PTSD alter ego, and asked permission for Scott to return. Mr. Ostrom, 36, now works steadily as an HVAC specialist and owns a home near Boulder, Colorado, which he shares with his girlfriend, Jamie Ernkrantz, and his service dog, an English lab named Tim. The reason I like calling this medicine is it stimulated my consciousness's ability for self-healing. Mr. Ostrom said, "You understand why it's okay to experience unconditional love for yourself." Merck pharmacists invented MDMA, which is short for 3,4-methylinksedoxy in methamphetamine in 1912. But the compound was largely forgotten until 1976, when Alexander Shulgin, a well-known psychedelic chemist, synthesized MDMA and tried it himself. Realizing that his discovery could have therapeutic value, Dr. Shulgin shared MDMA in 1977 with Leo Zeff, a psychotherapist who introduced it to other mental health professionals, and over the next 8 years, hundreds of therapists and others administered an estimated 500,000 doses of MDMA. Some reported that in just a few sessions with the medication, patients achieved an amount of progress that would normally take years. In the early 1980s, however, MDMA escaped from the clinic to the dance floor, where it became known as ecstasy. In 1985, the Drug Enforcement Administration criminalized MDMA as a Schedule I substance defined as having no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Some mental health professionals continued to administer MDMA-assisted therapy underground, but most stopped. The numbers of scientists who pursued studies with MDMA also dwindled, but a few individuals continued to push strongly on the behalf of MDMA research, including Dr. Dolben, who founded his association in 1986 to focus on developing MDMA and other psychedelics into medications approved by the FDA. It took nearly 2 decades to overcome alarmist claims about ecstasy's dangers, including that it ate holes in users' brains. It finally gained approval to begin studies, then it finally gained approval to begin studies. Research in animals and humans confirms that MDMA produces no neurotoxic effects at the doses administered in the clinical trials. Ecstasy, or Molly, on the other hand, can be altered with other potentially dangerous substances, and users may take far higher doses than are safe. In 2011, MDMA accounted for 1.8% of all drug-related emergency department visits. According to a database maintained until that year by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, in Europe, MDMA was responsible for 8% of drug-related emergency visits to 16 major hospitals in 10 countries from 2013 to 2014. Scientists still do not fully understand the source of MDMA's therapeutic effects. The substance binds to proteins to regulate the serotonin, the neurotransmitter that can, among other things, lift mood. Antidepressant medications like Prozac bind to these same proteins and block their reabsorption of the serotonin. But MDMA takes this process further, causing the proteins to pump serotonin into synapses, strengthening their chemical signal. MDMA also elevates oxytocin, dopamine, and other chemical messengers, producing feelings of empathy, trust, and compassion. So that's kind of an interesting win for the drug world. Now, let's get in here to some stock talk. How about that? That's a pretty good little news thing. How about it? All right, so I'm waiting on Robinhood to load here. Still waiting. Here we go. All right, so it has been a great day for me. I'm actually up $326 on Dogecoin today, which is sitting at 43 cents and some change, and I'm up to $2,738.74. Like I said, it's been a great day. So, with that being said, there are plenty of things that everybody should be doing. 1. Buy Dogecoin. Keep buying it. 2, let's just say you've got a stock that you've been invested in, but maybe it's going down, and you're thinking about selling out, maybe trying to mitigate all of your losses by just cutting it short. Let me suggest another alternative to you. Instead of selling out, how about instead you continue to throw more money into it? The cheaper it gets, the more your average cost per share, will decrease, and the more shares you'll have, and when it goes back up to where you bought it at, perhaps, then you're going to be making profit at a lower point. So you won't need it to go all the way back up. You'll just need it to go back to where the average between where you bought it and the new price. So that would be one little piece of advice. And I'm doing that right now with Castor Maritime. At one point, I had an average cost well over $1, and now, after buying a total of 61 shares, I have an average cost of 58 cents, and it is currently sitting at 49. So if I wanted to, I could actually buy more and continue to make my price go down. I don't have the available cash at the moment. Everything's kind of tied up, so I'm not going to do it. But Ethereum has exploded today. Coinbase is something you need to be looking at. Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV. Ripple is doing pretty good things today. I mean, it's generally down, but it's going to go back up. All these cryptocurrencies are crushing it. Crushing it, folks. And then let's look at some of these other ones. It sucks that some of these penny stocks on here you can't really get. Some of these ones I sold out are doing terrible, so I'm very happy I sold out. Like Zamitica, it's down to 95 cents. I think I sold out when it was at like $1.50. So, I mean, good call there. I wanted to basically pull all the profit that I've made so far and pour it into Castor Maritime to kind of offset the losses, because that one was the one that I had lost by percentage the most. So I wanted to kind of cover everything. A couple years ago, when I first started investing, Teradyne was a company, stock symbol TER, was a company that I was telling everybody to be on the lookout for in 2019. And that at that time, it was sitting at $20-ish. And today it is sitting at a loss, but at a total of $124.83. So if you would have stayed in there, you would have made some straight money. Yeah. Looks like Doge is going down. So, kind of. I mean, I don't expect it to stay up like this. It's going to go up and down regardless of what you're invested in. Just stay the course, folks. Stay the course. What's happening right now, a lot of these things are increasing in price, and you're like, wow, everything's getting more valuable. It's not, okay? What's happening is inflation is happening. So over the next 2 years, because of all the stimulus that we've had with Donald Trump and with Joe Biden, we are going to have a very, very inflated economy. In just March alone, we had a 2.5% increase in inflation. So we need to understand that it's not the prices that are getting higher, it's the dollar that is becoming less valuable. So most of us will be getting raises over the next 2 years, and then everything's going to get stagnant, because that's the innate place after inflation is just stagnance. And then you'll raise, people are going to campaign for more minimum wage increases, and they'll probably get it to happen any day. I'm expecting the $15 minimum wage to happen with Joe Biden. But, it's all just lip service, and it's all Band-Aids. Folks, until we start electing people who actually understand capitalism, who actually understand free trade, and who are not trying to spend more money year over year, who are not trying to take more money in year over year as a governing body, then we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to improve our situations. We're actually going to do the opposite. Now, some people think, well, isn't it a freedom to have Medicare or Medicaid? No. Not at all. No. What? I have never once used Medicare or Medicaid, yet I have paid for it basically as long as I've been working. How does that even make sense? I could be making more money and possibly be able to afford, cheaper doctor's visits if they were a thing that was allowed by the government. Then, we'd be living in that world and being able to survive a little easier. But some people think that the government taking money from each of us and giving it to other people seems right. And I don't. But let me leave you with this. Whether you agree with me or you don't, we need to understand the world around us a little better every day. And that's the point of this podcast. It's to challenge the current beliefs held by society. It's to further deep dive into the things that build our great nation, or built it, I should say. It's not like it's building it anymore. There was a time when our gross domestic product was way higher by percentage. Our growth every year was way higher, but it's not. Not now. And people, a lot of people, like Republicans, they seem to think, without government doing certain things, like without government protecting farmers, then we just wouldn't have food. Okay, well then explain to me Hong Kong. Okay? If Hong Kong, a place with no natural resources to speak of essentially, gets all of its food imported, how are they any worse for wear? Those people who would be farmers found jobs doing other things. Or they moved, or they, just never became a farmer. And in which case, in that particular part of the country, or part of the world really, it wasn't necessary. What they needed was people to work in a factory. What they needed was people to work on computer chips or whatever. Hong Kong has been one of the epicenters of capitalism for nearly 5 decades. China is trying to do its best to take over and make sure that stops. We need to help them. That is it. Folks, that's going to do it. Yeah, that's going to do it. That's episode 27 of That Political Show. I'm your host, Curtis Brown. Thank you for listening. I'm glad to be back and doing all of these. My voice feels better. It's just been too infrequent. Big shout out now to Arcade Dreamer for the instrumental version of Dangerous from his debut album Born in the Midnight. Available anywhere music can be listened to. Spotify, Apple, Amazon, etc. Follow him on Facebook and Instagram at Arcade Dreamer Official. Twitter at Arcade_Dreamer. YouTube and Bandcamp at Arcade Dreamer. You can also follow the Curtis Podcast Network on Facebook at Curtis Podcast Network, Twitter at Curtis Network, and TikTok at the Curtis Podcast Network. Thank you for listening, everybody, and I hope you have a great day. Be good people.